So I want to start by highlighting the word precision. Now, precision is important, isn't it? Would you agree? Thank you. Where's John Miller? There's John. John works all week on a lathe. He's a fitter and turner. Ask John about what he thinks is of the importance of precision. I'm sure he will tell you it's very important. Or you could ask Nathan about the importance of precision when it comes to perhaps irrigation calculations. Or Damo, the importance of precision in respect to building boats. We all know that precision is vital for anything to work and to work well. Could this be also true of Christianity? What if we were not fed the truth about Jesus? What if we were not given precise details? What if we were given imprecise or contradictory details about him? What if we were told that Jesus was just a mere man who got caught up in a zealot's cause against the Roman occupiers of the land? I mean, wouldn't that be catastrophic to all believers, especially to those who gave their lives for the faith? You see, lies and deception really are a grievous evil because they do more than merely offend. They actually destroy. And by replacing God's truth with false reality, deception ends up shattering a person's faith. And when faith is the truth is destroyed, the foundation for salvation is removed, leading to the ultimate downfall of a person's faith and life. And this is Luke's concern here. Certainty is what he says in verse 4. Certainty about what has been taught is his aim and his mission. And of course, Luke's no dummy. He is known for his work as a doctor. Here in Colossians 4 verse 14, Paul notes, Luke, the beloved physician, sends his greetings. In the New Testament, it was not uncommon for what they called an amanuensis to be used to write letters or epistles. You could say a secretary. They had secretaries who was able to write down the points the apostles made. Tertius was one such person. You could say he was Paul's secretary who wrote down his words in the epistle in the book of Romans. I, Tertius, who wrote this letter, greet you in the Lord. But of course, when Paul wanted to give assurance regarding the contents of a letter that they were indeed his, he signed his epistle using his own handwriting in order to authenticate the epistle as coming from himself. And he would do that by inserting his own identifiable handwriting. You could say it'd be like signing a letter. Here in Thessalonians, the greeting is in my own hand, he says, Paul, which is a distinguishing mark in every letter. This is the way I write. He obviously had some distinguishing style or words that authenticated the letter as coming from him, authorized by him. Now, when we come to Luke's writing, Luke and Acts, we actually find that no such indicators exist. Luke hasn't used a secretary. He's written the gospel himself. And you know, it is said that the books of Luke and Acts contain some of the most sophisticated and polished Greek in the whole New Testament. And of course, we can include Acts because Luke and Acts are really one work, one book. That's actually divided, you could say, into volume 1 and volume 2. Let's just touch base here with we can say the prefaces of both books. In Luke 1 verse 3, he says, it seemed fitting for me as well, having investigated everything carefully from the beginning, to write it out for you in orderly sequence, most excellent Theophilus. And then in the preface to Acts, the first account, O Theophilus, I composed, about all that Jesus began to do and teach until the day he was taken up to heaven after he had, through the Holy Spirit, given orders to the apostles whom he had chosen. So you could say that Luke has really done a mountain of work here in investigating everything carefully so that his patron, Theophilus, would know the certainty of the things that he had been orally taught concerning Jesus. And Theophilus was probably, likely, a socially prominent person. Luke addresses him as most excellent, a title that elsewhere was given for Roman officials, although his exact role, Theophilus' role, is not known. And so he writes his work to him in 2 volumes, Luke and Acts. It was not unusual to split writings in the ancient world, since long works were often divided into multiple scrolls. Because you see, they're not books like you have in your hand in our pew Bibles. They're not books, they're scrolls. A single scroll had practical limits on length. So Luke's history of Jesus and his history of the early church appear in 2 parts. But both together, we find share a continuity and a dependency on each other. Luke emphasises that what has taken place has been fulfilled among us. Fulfilled. Inasmuch as many have undertaken to compile an account of the things that have been fulfilled among us. Now, other translations will use things that have been accomplished among us. The stress appears to be on this historical realization that has taken place. You know, the events that have come to full realization among us. Christianity, in Luke's understanding, begins not with ideas or teachings, but with the things that happened, things that occurred in history. We call it revelation. God revealing himself through the person and life of Jesus. The word Luke uses, fulfilled, means that these events have been brought to their full completion. They were not partial, they're not unfinished acts. They reached the point for which they were intended. In other words, Luke is describing events that have been carried through to their full completion. I guess you could say it's akin to or similar to what the book of Hebrews said from at the start. How God, having spoken long ago to the fathers and the prophets in many portions and many ways, in these last days spoke to us in his Son, whom he appointed heir of all things, through whom also he made the worlds. So Luke also says that these things happened among us. Now that's important. They happened among us. It's highlighting that Jesus' life and work took place within the reality of human experience, showing God's actions in the world through eyewitness accounts. The gospel, therefore, is rooted in real historical events in which God acted. And when Luke's gospel is read together there with the book of Acts, the picture becomes clearer. In the gospel, the decisive saving event took place. Jesus dies, he rises from the dead, he ascends to heaven. Those acts are complete. The book of Acts then records the spread of the message about what God has already done, not additional saving work that still needs to be accomplished. Luke, therefore, begins his account by pointing to these completed acts of God in history. Events that have been brought to their full saving realization among the people, especially through these eyewitnesses. He writes so that his reader, Theophilus, and no doubt others, can know with, here's the word again, certainty of what took place. Now, when I was wrestling years ago with becoming a Christian, I was wrestling over how I could justify believing in God and Jesus. People in society, you could say, in general, see faith in Jesus, faith in God as akin to believing in, say, fairies or leprechauns, like believing with no evidence, hope in whatever. So I was very hesitant for a long time about accepting the faith. And I guess, to be honest, God brought me into the faith without me fully convinced. I hadn't ticked all the boxes. I still had my doubts. I had to surrender because the call of God was so strong. After turning to the Lord, yet still not putting it all together, I had chances then to process more fully what I had committed to. And you know, the prominent aspect that settled my doubts is what we read here in verse 2. Just as those who from the beginning were eyewitnesses and servants of the word handed them down to us. When it comes to evidence, some bits of evidence are more authoritative than others. I worked from what I was convinced of to what I was unsure of. You know, the known to the unknown. I don't know if you saw it, but I recently posted in the Growth Group channel an AI take on the resurrection. And without going into the reasons how or why, I found this AI, the artificial intelligence they call it, the analysis to be very profound. And I want to just quote some of it here. The historical case for the resurrection, it says, is stronger than most people realise, believer or skeptic. You have a movement that exploded out of Jerusalem within weeks of the crucifixion, led by people who claim to have seen the risen Christ and who died for that claim. People die for beliefs they hold sincerely, but that are false. Martyrdom proves sincerity, not truth. But the apostles weren't dying for a belief. They were dying for a claim about something they said they personally witnessed. People don't die for something that, People don't die for something they know to be a hoax they invented. Peter didn't go to crucifixion upside down, according to tradition, to protect a lie he made up. James, the brother of Jesus, who didn't believe during Jesus' lifetime, didn't suddenly lead the Jerusalem church because he was committed to a family conspiracy. Something happened to these people that they interpreted as encountering the physically risen Jesus, and it was convincing enough that they chose death rather than recantation. You see, for the Christian, faith is not based on a subjective feeling. It is based on evidence. God, in his grace, has based faith in Jesus on the historical resurrection from the dead. And this is what I would call an objective reality. You see, no one in their right mind would say that people can rise from the dead. No one would, unless God raised that person from the dead. Faith, therefore, has its foundation in objective reality. So since I judge these witnesses to be true witnesses, then I can surely trust their word, known to the unknown. After all, for someone to choose death rather than recant what they saw or deny what they saw, then I do believe these men would tell the truth. And so from this point on, I branched out in my understanding of what God has said and done. They were not just eyewitnesses, but servants, or that word can mean minister, servants or ministers of the word handed down to us. The Apostle Peter wrote in his epistle, "For we did not make known to you the power and coming of our Lord Jesus Christ, following cleverly devised myths about fairies or leprechauns, you could say, but being eyewitnesses of his majesty." So they're not giving propaganda for their own cause, but they were under the authority of Jesus. They're ministers, servants of the word. Or here, the Apostle John, he says this, he says, "What was from the beginning, what we have heard, what we have seen with our eyes, what we beheld, touched with our hand, concerning the word of life." So were these men telling the truth? Well, if they are not, they died for that truth, which seems ridiculous unless in fact it was true. Who willingly dies for something they know is false? Furthermore, these men were God-fearers, right? Even before they knew Jesus. They understood the serious nature of giving false testimony about God. This is what Paul writes to the Corinthians about. He says, "And if Christ has not been raised, then our preaching is vain, your faith also is vain. Moreover," he says, "we have even been found to be false witnesses of God, because we bore witness against God that he raised Christ, whom he did not raise, if in fact the dead are not raised." So in other words, if the resurrection was not true, the apostles would be guilty of lying about what God has done. Yet, these were men deeply concerned about honouring God. Consider Paul in particular. As Saul, before he became a Christian, he was so zealous for God, he aggressively persecuted the church because he was doing it in the name of God. So he thought. A man with that kind of zeal for God would not knowingly invent a story about God raising Jesus from the dead, especially when his upbringing was diametrically opposed to a suffering Messiah. Now, these eyewitness accounts were then passed on to others, including Luke. Through the testimony of those who had seen these events, Luke wrote his gospel, and during a time when many of those witnesses were still alive. Paul even reminds the Corinthians that Jesus appeared to a large group of witnesses from whom they could get confirmation from. He says in chapter 15, verse 6, "After that, he, Jesus, appeared to more than 500 brothers at one time, most of whom remain until now, but some have fallen asleep or died." So at that time that Paul wrote, most of those witnesses who saw the risen Christ were still alive. In other words, the Corinthians could do a check. They could confirm, they could verify that claim. The testimony about Jesus' resurrection was not hidden. It was not private. It was open to confirmation by those who had seen him. So we look at our final point in verse 3 and 4, the importance again of certainty. "It seemed fitting for me as well," says Luke, "having investigated everything carefully from the beginning, to write it out for you in orderly sequence, most excellent Theophilus, so that you may know the certainty about the things you have been taught." Well, Luke's gospel is one of 4 gospels that were canonized in what we know as the New Testament. The 4 gospels, we heard before, Matthew, Mark, Luke, John. They were firmly established in the eyes of the church by 170 AD. Up to AD 100 was what we would call the apostolic age. The gospel sayings, the accounts of Jesus, were written and circulated individually among the churches. The gospel was communicated through the teachings of the apostles. They delivered both direct instruction through these letters that were circulated among the churches. The events, the words of Jesus, were preserved in the testimony of the apostles, in the testimony of the eyewitnesses. And they were beginning to be written down, assembled, and became known to us as the Gospels. And then from 100 to 150 AD, church leaders like Ignatius of Antioch, Polycarp, another chap, began quoting the Gospels as authoritative. About 140 AD, the heretic Marcion, he actually forced the issue by rejecting all the Gospels except his own redacted version of Luke's Gospel. In other words, he only cherry-picked what he wanted out of Luke's Gospel and rejected all the others. And of course, this then prompted the church to clarify which Gospel accounts were truly apostolic. And so around AD 150, Justin Martyr describes the Gospels as, quote, memoirs of the apostles. And he says that they were being read in Sunday morning worship along with the Old Testament prophets. And so then, of course, in 170 AD, Justin Martyr's student, Tatian, produced what we know as the harmony of the Gospels. He combined the four Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, into a single work they called the Diatessaron. So what this proves is that by 170 AD, the four Gospels were already viewed as a distinct and complete set. So we come to 180 AD, you have there Irenaeus, he was another early church father. He could take it for granted that there could neither be more nor less than four Gospels, just as he says that as there are 4 points to the compass. So now, while the four Gospels are essentially in agreement, you do find there are divergences within the four Gospels. These divergences accounts for differences in the style of the author, differences in whom they are writing it to, and differences in purpose. And when we consider that the Gospel of John left out the early life of Jesus, his birth and his childhood, we see that John's Gospel is different from the other three in this respect. There's no shepherds in the early part of John's Gospel. There's no star over Bethlehem. Totally left out. The other three, of course, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, they include all that and they follow a similar path with one another, encompassing the full length of Jesus' life. So we call those three the Synoptic Gospels. However, just because there are differences between the Gospels, it doesn't follow that there are contradictions. The differences are in emphases, points that individual authors wish to make. There is also the particular style of the author in making those points. For example, we know that Mark was writing to Romans, and he brings out a particular point to them about Jesus. So in his gospel, he makes strong points about the power and authority of Jesus. Now, of course, the other Gospels are aware of the power and authority of Jesus, but they're not highlighting those aspects to the same level of intensity that Mark does. You see, the Romans were captivated by power and authority. Rome, as the center of the empire, radiated both, and they were proud of it. If a Roman commander tells you what to do, you don't say, It's all right, I'll take care of it after smoko, boss. Well, your funeral will be taken care of even before the end of smoko. Get that? So the word immediately comes to mind when I think of the book of Mark. Mark is the shortest gospel, yet the word immediately appears over 40 times and way more than any other book in the New Testament, especially the other Gospels. Look how it compares there. The one in red is Mark. So Mark uses the word immediately, not merely to describe the speed of a miracle, but to demonstrate that when Jesus speaks, the created order, whether physical or spiritual, is compelled to respond immediately. You see? So naturally, Mark is making the readers in Rome well aware of Jesus' power and authority. I mean, if they thought they had it all, they should think again. Theirs is nothing compared to the person of Jesus. My point being, all those things about Jesus are true. And of course, there are also many things that Jesus said and did that no one could possibly capture. Every single facet of Jesus and his ministry. So John makes this bit of a footnote here in his gospel. He says, this is the disciple who is bearing witness to these things and who wrote these things, and we know that his witness is true. And there are also many other things which Jesus did, which if they were written one after the other, I suppose that even the world itself could not contain the books that would be written. So imagine, if you would, you're at an intersection, right? And there is an accident there. Cars are all banged up. There are 4 corners of an intersection. Let's imagine there are 4 witnesses, one on each corner, witness to this accident. One was a lawyer, one was a race car driver, one was a police officer, and one was a panel beater. Now, will those different people give the exact same description or report? Probably not. And you know what? If they all gave exactly the same, you think they're reading from the same script and it was manufactured. You'd worry if it was all exactly the same. Would they describe the very accident that happened? Well, yes, they would, of course. However, each of those witnesses would describe the incident from their own particular standpoint. For example, the lawyer is thinking of the lawsuit that would ensue against the driver who did the wrong thing and caused the accident. The race car driver was more interested in telling his story about how fast the cars were travelling. The police officer was interested in telling the story from the standpoint of who was at fault, whilst the panel beater told the story emphasising the damage done and the cost and difficulty of repairing those vehicles. So as you can see, 4 different but complementary perspectives. They all agree on the details of what happened, but either through their particular line of interest or the particulars of who they are telling the story to, you will get minor differences in emphases and purpose. In the Gospels, you will find slightly differing but complementary accounts about Jesus' life, death, and resurrection. The Gospels, you could say, are just coming from different angles. But together, you are getting a full, not erroneous, perspective on Jesus. When you consider Matthew's Gospel, you have a look in there, it's written to Jews. And very clearly, he's pointing out there that Jesus fulfilled the law. And you should see how many times he quotes the Old Testament there. He's writing to Jews with a particular purpose. Mark, as I just said, to Romans, who to the readers valued power and authority. John, we believe, was written to Ephesus, countering the philosophy there of the Greeks, pointing out that the Logos was not, as they thought, some impersonal force, something like, Star Wars, akin to, or may the Force be with you, this impersonal force, but pointing out that this Logos was made flesh and appeared among us. He was real flesh and blood. See, the gospel writers are trying to point out to their readers the things that mattered and what was most important in establishing their faith. Luke notes here, quote, "Many have undertaken to compile the account of things that have been fulfilled among us." Well, his purpose is to do the same. He is not saying that the others were sloppy, but he's ensuring that through excellent research and accuracy, precision, Theophilus can know with certainty the things that he has been taught. He has been taught verbally, but Luke is compiling a gospel. He's writing it down about all the things that Jesus has said and done. So why is certainty important? Certainty is something that gives us security and hope. I want to give you an illustration of how this word certainty was used at the time. The Greek word here, aphileia, is connected to our English word, asphalt. Aphileia literally means not falling, unshakable. It denotes something that is firm, secure, cannot be tripped up. Asphalt, or tar, pitch, was used to line the inner walls of ships to make them safe and secure. We could say watertight. And yes, we know too that asphalt is the bitumen on our roads. It means to us a firm base, does it not? After days of rain, you might expect to get bogged if you go on a dirt road where it's been raining for days on end. But one that has asphalt, bitumen, means that it has a firm base. So you could say that Luke's written account of Jesus is to be aphileia, a firm and secure base in confirming the things that Theophilus has been taught. So the word became metaphorical for certainty. And in his gospel, Luke painstakingly researches to give solid, unshakable certainty that prevents Theophilus or any readers from tripping or falling into doubt about the facts of Jesus' life, death, and resurrection. Just as he uses it here also in the book of Acts, where he says, "Therefore let all the house of Israel know for certain," aphileia, "that God has made him both Lord and Christ, this Jesus whom you crucified." So I hope this morning that as you have pondered these things, that if you have any doubts, that you deal with them, that you make sure you deal with them until you become strong and secure in the faith. Doubts are forgivable, but they are not something Jesus sees as helpful nor profitable. These are the very things that actually cause people to fall away from the faith. And if you have doubts, there's plenty of help if you're struggling with some doubts. But don't let embarrassment or pride prevent you from being honest about it, forthright in wanting to tackle it. In reality, it is a problem for every Christian to some degree and at certain points in their life, whether they like to admit it or not. But if you have those doubts and if you want to share with me or one of the elders, by all means do so. We'd love to hear from you and help you work through any of those things that might cause an issue. But one of the things we see here in Luke's gospel is the importance of certainty. And I'm sure you want to be certain too about your faith. So don't let today pass you by without resolving those things that you might be doubting in your own heart. Please seek help and let's get strong and secure in our faith. Amen.